And the next nugget in the series will cover the areas defined in the PMBOK guide as project scope management. This nugget, focused on scope definition, will cover the first three areas defined in the PMBOK guide, which is scope planning, scope definition, and creating the WBS. In other words, defining the specific details related to the scope that's necessary for your project to deliver successfully. And the next nugget, scope management, will cover the remaining two areas from the PMBOK guide, which is the scope verification and scope control. In other words, the ongoing activities related to ensuring that the project is delivering to the scope definition that we're defining in this nugget. The first step in scope definition is developing an effective scope management plan. You need to understand the level of detail that's going to be appropriate for your project. Small, simple projects that may take one person 3 months to complete, will certainly require a far less detailed scope plan than a very large, complex project that's going to take tens to hundreds of people and months to years to complete. So it's very important that you understand the level of detail appropriate for your project and develop your project scope document based on the appropriate level of detail based on the size and complexity of your project. Another significant factor you need to bring into account in scope planning is the general project environment. How successful has your organization been delivering projects in this particular area for this particular business unit using this technology? What is the company's experience? How has the company succeeded or failed? What aspects of scope in previous projects aided in the success of the project or resulted in the failure of projects? You need to understand the project environment. You need to look at the history. You need to learn from mistakes. You need to look at the lessons learned from other projects and factor that in as part of your overall scope plan. The final result is you need to produce a scope management plan. The scope management plan is going to define the process to be used to define the scope and the overall management of the scope. Again, the scope management plan needs to be defined at the appropriate level of detail. Small, simple projects may require a sentence or a paragraph in the overall project plan defining the scope management strategy. Large, complex projects may require a separate document specifically outlining the roles and responsibilities, the processes to be followed, the change management processes to be followed. So again, you need to apply a great degree of control and discipline in producing your scope plan to ensure that you're defining and managing the scope at the appropriate level of detail commensurate with the project size, the project's importance, and the overall project's complexity. With the scope management plan in place, the next step is to define the actual scope for the project. In essence, defining the scope is defining what is included. Defining the scope defines what it is the project needs to accomplish, what the deliverables for the project are going to be. Effectively defining the scope means identifying all of the work, all of the end products, defining the functionality, defining the usage, defining the actual final product or products that's going to be delivered as part of the project. Defining the scope is critical to overall project success because until you have it defined, you can't manage it. You can't manage what you can't define. You must have that clear, unambiguous, well-defined definition of what is included, what is in the project, in order to be able to successfully manage it. A key to defining the scope is to define what is included in the project. But unfortunately, that is very difficult in many circumstances because the project's end goal is well known, but exactly how to achieve that end goal, what that final product is going to look like to achieve the goal, is often unclear. So therefore, doing that complete, unambiguous definition of scope is very challenging. So often it's as easy to define what is not included in the scope as well as what's included in the scope. The key is to define the scope, but again, because the project's end goal is known, but the project's end state is not known, Sometimes it is as easy to define what is not included as it is to define what is included. To provide an example, let's take a scenario where we're going to build a bread box. And yes, I mean a bread box, that metal container, that plastic container that sits on the counter in your kitchen that stores bread to keep it fresh. So to define our bread box, let's set up our matrix, set up two columns, and say what is in scope and what is not in scope. So in scope, we're going to define the dimensions. The length, the width, and the height. We're going to define the composition. We're going to define what it's made out of. So we're going to define our bread box with dimensions. We're going to define that our bread box is made out of metal. We're going to define the opening, that it has an opening on the front, that it hinges from the bottom, and so on. So those are the kind of things we need to define in scope to define what is in scope. But we also need to define what is not in scope. Maybe you're a fan of high-tech gadgets and you are aware of a bread box that has automatic controls. There's a little computer chip inside your bread box that measures the humidity level, that measures the temperature, and automatically when the inside controls or the inside environment is not optimal for the storage of bread, is going to turn on fans, is going to turn on dehumidifiers to improve the environment for the bread box. So we're absolutely defining what is not in scope. We're defining automatic control for the bread box is not in scope. We're going to define that lock on the door of the bread box is not in scope. We're going to define other components that maybe is feasible for a bread box. Again, the high-tech bread box with all the gadgets and all the whistles is going to be concluded, but that's not in our bread box. So we're defining absolutely what is not defined in the bread box as well as what is defined for our bread box. So we're defining the dimensions. It's going to be 8 inches long by 14 inches high by 23 inches deep. It's going to be made out of aluminum. It's going to have an opening on the front that is going to hinge from the bottom. But we're defining what it is not. It is not a high-tech bread box. It does not have automatic control. It does not have locking. It does not have, it does not have, it does not have. So again, often you can see that our definition of our bread box, and I think a bread box is a fairly simplistic thing that most people can associate with. We're defining the specific dimensions, and those specific dimensions are consistent with everyone's expectation of what a bread box is, but we're also defining specific criteria that our bread box is not, so that we're not delivering a high-tech bread box. We're not delivering a child-proof bread box. We're not delivering a bread box that's capable of functioning in outer space. We're not delivering a bread box that is capable of being submersed in water. Some people's definitions of bread box will include the automatic controls, the locks, the child-proofing, the out of space, the out of. So by defining the not, we're absolutely managing expectations, because that's what scope definition is all about. It's managing expectations to ensure that we're defining what is included in the scope, the dimensions, the composition, the opening, and we're defining what is not to ensure that people's wild dreams, that we are absolutely managing the expectations. We're making it very clear what is in the scope of our project and what is not in the scope of our project. When we're defining scope, effectively we're creating a box. Everything included in the box is the scope of the project. It's your problem. It's your project. So in the case of our bread box, we define the dimensions, the length, the width, the height. We determine the materials. We determine the opening. Now, I'm not going to list the nots out here, but everything outside the scope, not your problem. Not your project. Now, that goes a long way to defining the scope. Everything inside this box is your problem. It's your project. And you're defining the specifics of what the scope is. Everything outside, as I say, is not your project, not your problem. But in most instances, there's going to be cross boundaries. There's going to be inflows to your project. There's going to be outflows to your project. By defining and managing these inflows and outflows, you are again helping to define your scope. So you're defining that it has to accept this input number 1. And you're going to define specifically what that input number 1 looks like. Now in the case of a bread box, the only input I can think of is the ability to take a loaf of bread and put into the bread box. And it's going to talk about the input or the output number 2. And again, in the case of a bread box, the inputs and outputs would be accepting of a full loaf of bread, and the output would be the ability to take bread out of the bread box for consumption. But if you can take your mind away from our bread box for a few minutes and think of an order management system, for example. So inbound would be the ability to receive inventory items from our suppliers. Outbound items would be the ability to ship product to our companies. Another outbound item would be the ability to ship invoices to our customers. Another outbound item will be the ability to create returns or warranty support for our product. And inbound will be the payments for our project. So as we start to define the inputs and the outputs for our project, we are beginning to define how the project is going to interact in the environment. So it's wonderful to try to create the scope and specifically define what is included in the scope, and that's critical and important. And as we discussed, it's important to define what is not in the scope, what is not your problem. That again helps define the scope of your project, but it's also important to begin to define the interfaces between your project and the corporate environment. What are the inflows? The raw materials, the inventory items. What are the outflows? The orders to the customers, the invoices to the customers, warranty support to customers, payments from customers. So as you start to work on your scope box, as you start to define what your project is and what the project is not, as well as how the project interacts with the environment, you're really starting to do a very clear, very well-defined definition of the scope. The next step in defining your scope is to define the project deliverables. Basically, you need to provide a list of all of the formal project deliverables. A formal project deliverable is an actual end product that the project will be presenting back to the business, back to the sponsor, as indication that a project objective has been achieved and that this deliverable, this end product, has value to the business in terms of achieving the overall project results. Some of the formal deliverables may be interim in-process deliverables. Some of the formal deliverables may be simply a more refined definition of the requirements, but you present that requirements definition, you obtain acceptance, and that allows your project to proceed to the next stage of the project, which is the definition of how those requirements will be satisfied and so on. So producing the list of the formal deliverables again defines the scope. It specifically defines what products your project is going to produce, and by examining and reviewing and understanding those end products, the acceptor or the business will be able to understand, yes, if all of these deliverables are produced, it will achieve my project results. So producing the list of project deliverables is a good step towards defining the scope. But simply defining you're going to produce deliverable number 1, deliverable number 2, deliverable number 3, which is the requirements, which is the design, which is the final product, is a good step, but that probably isn't clear enough. That still leaves room for interpretation, leaves room for ambiguity. So instead of simply providing a list of final deliverables, you need to provide a list of final deliverables with a paragraph, defining the purpose. So if you say, I'm going to produce a requirements document and have a paragraph defining that says the requirements document will list all of the business requirements, or better still, the requirements document will list the 5 major business requirements that are going to be supported by this application. Again, you're better managing the expectations. You're better ensuring that the requirements document that addresses 5, remember we stated the number, 5 business requirements, is going to support the final goal for the business. The next step in definition for requirements or the formal deliverables is not to just produce a paragraph defining the purpose. It's going to produce a full table of contents that says the requirements document is going to contain section number 1, executive summary, section number 2, evaluation of current situation, section number 3, evaluation of alternatives, section number 4, selection of preferred solution. So by providing a table of contents for your formal deliverable, you're again better refining what that end product, what that deliverable is going to look like, allow the business to better ascertain, is this achieving my purpose? If I get a requirements definition document that has these sections, is it what I want? The next step would be to take your table of contents and provide a suggested number of pages. So for each section in the table of contents, the executive summary is going to be 2 pages long. The current situation analysis is going to be 10 to 15 pages long. So again, you're now defining the level of detail that will be in each section of your table of contents. So again, you're better managing expectations. If in section 2, the evaluation of the current situation, you're telling the business it's going to be 10 to 15 pages long, that, in my mind, says it's a fairly high-level review of the current situation. If you can summarize the current situation of a business in 10 to 15 pages, you are certainly doing a summary, where if the business was expecting a detailed evaluation of each and every function and each and every process in the current situation, their expectation would be that section of the deliverable would be 75 to 90 pages long. So again, you're doing a good job of defining the expectations. You're doing a good job of managing the expectations to ensure that there's no ambiguity. The final step would be to, again, provide a paragraph that says, in the executive summary, we will do, and it will be 2 pages long. In the current situation assessment, we will do, and it will be 10 to 15 pages long. So again, you need to define the deliverables. The deliverables define what the final product the business will be accepting. The list of the deliverables will allow the business to understand what is being delivered and whether that will allow them to achieve their objectives. Taking the list of deliverables and providing a paragraph defining the purpose is going to allow them to better level set, manage their expectations as to whether this is truly going to satisfy their requirements. Providing a table of contents provides more detail. Providing a table of contents with the number of pages is going to, again, further refine expectations. And finally, providing the table of contents with the number of pages and the description of what's going to be in it is going to do, I believe, an excellent job of managing expectations. So why did I present this as options? Why did I say you could just do a list of deliverables, or you could do a list of deliverables with descriptions, or with table of contents, or with number of pages, or with complete descriptions? It goes back to our original scope plan. What is the level of detail we need to go into for the scope definition for our project? A small one-person, 3-month project? I don't believe you're going to do a deliverable definition down to the table of contents with estimated number of pages with a narrative for each section in the table of contents. That's too much detail for a small, simple project. But for a very large project that involves hundreds of people and years' worth of effort, defining the deliverables at this level of detail is absolutely essential to ensuring that you are able to understand, able to manage, and able to deliver to the business's expectations. So again, level set, define the deliverables at the appropriate level of detail based on the size and complexity of your project,
But by all means, define the deliverables. It's part of the scope definition. It's the part of the scope definition that makes the most sense to the business sponsor, because then the business can say, yes, if I get these 3, 5, 8 deliverables, and if these deliverables have what I expect in them, and you're managing the expectations at the level of detail here, then yes, this project will achieve my stated goals. I will get the benefit from this project that I expect to receive.
The next step in the process is to define the acceptance criteria. How are each of the deliverables, how are each of the end products for your project going to be accepted? Only by clearly defining the acceptance criteria, i.e. only by defining the yardstick, the measurement factors that will be applied against the deliverables, the final products, will you truly be able to define the scope of what those end products should look like. Part of the acceptance criteria is the definition of who. Who in the project team, who in the business organization has responsibility for accepting each deliverable, each final product. Ideally, the project sponsor, the project acceptor, would be the acceptor for each of the deliverables, but often the project sponsor doesn't have the subject matter expertise, and in some instances simply may not have the time to devote to accepting each and every single project deliverable. It's key that you understand who is going to accept which documents. So which deliverables are going to be accepted by which individuals from the business community. By working with that individual, you can then ascertain what their acceptance criteria is going to be. Again, understand the yardstick, understand the measurement that they're going to use to define acceptance. And that defines how. How will they accept? How do they measure? If they receive a document, how will they measure that the document has satisfied the objectives? Will they measure it against the table of contents? Will they measure it against the number of business processes? Will they measure it against the style and presentation of the document? How are they going to measure acceptance? And finally, what is the acceptance process? You may think we've already defined the acceptance process by defining who and what, but there's more to the acceptance process than that. What is deemed acceptable? What is okay? Now, what does that mean? Is it okay if the final deliverable, if the final product has errors in it? And you may think instantly, no, you could never accept a deliverable, a final product that has errors in it. But think about something like buying a home. You go in to buy a new home in a new subdivision, you do your final walkthrough, and as part of your final walkthrough, i.e. your final acceptance, you have your measurement criteria, and in that measurement criteria you walk through your home and you determine that there's a piece of finish missing in the closet in bedroom number 2. As you walk through the home, you notice there's a paint chip on the door jamb in the living room. As you walk through the final inspection, you notice that there's a tile cracked in the kitchen. In my experience of buying a home, those 3 flaws are not enough to say, no, I won't accept this home. No, you must rebuild, you must tear the home down and rebuild it from scratch. Those 3 flaws, a missing piece of finish, a chip on a piece of paint, a cracked tile, are not enough to say, I will not accept the home. They're simply saying, the home is okay, but I will accept it with these 3 flaws, but they must be fixed in 10 days. So it's entirely possible in a business scenario to deliver a final product to the business that has flaws. So again, you're defining what is the acceptance criteria, what is deemed acceptable. Are 3 minor flaws acceptable? What if you walked through the home and found 10 minor flaws? Is that acceptable? What if you walked through the home and found 25 minor flaws? You're probably getting to the point where with 25 minor flaws in a brand new home, you're going to say, no, this isn't acceptable. You're not getting my final payment until all of these flaws are corrected. You're not getting any money from me. You're getting no acceptance. If there are 250 minor flaws, absolutely that final product is not acceptable. So you're defining what is acceptable, how many flaws, and you're defining what is a flaw. If it's a paint chip, if it's a missing piece of finish in a closet, if it is a cracked tile, that's a flaw. If the outside door was missing, that's probably not a flaw. A missing outside door is a serious critical fault and absolutely unacceptable. If an inside door is missing, is that a critical fault or is that a serious fault? So it may well be that you can accept the final home with 3 flaws and 1 critical fault, i.e. a missing door, but no serious faults. So that's what defining the acceptance criteria is all about. Understanding who will do the acceptance, understanding how, what their measurement criteria is going to be, how are they going to measure acceptability, and understanding what constitutes that acceptability. What is okay? How many minor flaws are acceptable? How many serious flaws are acceptable? Are critical flaws acceptable? And I hazard a guess that critical flaws would never be acceptable. But you need to define the acceptance criteria, and then you need to define the scope of your project to ensure that you're able to satisfy that acceptance criteria. Now I'm not suggesting that you deliberately build into your project plan a strategy to introduce 5 flaws into the final acceptance, but you need to know as part of your testing, as part of your preparation for final inspection, how thorough, how diligent, how much internal inspection do you need to apply to ensure that the final product is within the bounds defined by acceptance criteria, as opposed to deliberately building in flaws. So with the acceptance criteria in place, with the deliverables clearly defined, with the scope box clearly defined, we are in the position to produce our scope document. The scope document, the scope statement, is probably the single most critical document you're going to be producing as part of project management. The scope document, the scope statement, defines how the rest of the project will be constructed, defines how the project will be delivered, and defines how the project will be concluded, what the final acceptance criteria is going to be. So the scope statement needs to identify the objectives for the project, why the business initiated the project in the beginning. It needs to define the specific requirements that the business has for the project. It needs to define the boundaries, i.e. what is in scope and what is not in scope, with sufficient definition to make it clear and unambiguous. You need to define the deliverables. The deliverables need to be defined at the appropriate level of detail. Is it simply a list of deliverables for a very small, simple project? Or is it a fully defined list of deliverables with tables of contents, an estimated number of pages, and narrative descriptions for each element in the table of contents for very large, complex projects? But with a combination of the boundaries and what's in scope and not in scope, you can fully define what it is the project needs to deliver. And then with the acceptance criteria in mind, what is the yardstick? What is the measurement that's going to be applied for project success? And any assumptions and constraints that are necessary to bound, to define, to put the scope statement in relative position in the organization. You have completed the definition of the project scope statement, and you are now prepared to move ahead with the definition of the project once that scope statement is signed off and approved by the business and signed off and approved by senior management. Once the scope statement has been reviewed and signed off by the project sponsor and acceptor, signed off and reviewed by senior management, our final step in scope definition is to create our work breakdown structure. Define the specific work required to achieve the results defined in the scope statement. Our work breakdown structure should be deliverable based. It should be based on the specific deliverables identified in the scope statement. So we need to define the unit of work required to complete each deliverable. We do this by the decomposition to the specific work required to satisfy, to produce the deliverables. If we take the example of the requirements definition document. So in our scope statement, we defined we're going to produce a requirements definition document. In the table of contents, we defined there was going to be a current situation assessment and that's as far as we took it in the scope definition. Here, in creating a work breakdown structure, we identify the specific units of work required to produce the current situation assessment. So the first thing we need to do is to review the system. Then we need to interview the users. Then we need to understand the current faults, the faults. Then we need to understand the needs. Then we need to. So we're looking at the deliverable, we're understanding each and every deliverable, and we're decomposing each deliverable to the specific work required. So we need to review the system. We need to interview the users. We need to understand the faults. We need to understand the needs. And we have 3, 4, 5 more tasks that are necessary to allow us to produce this section of the table of contents, which will ultimately produce the requirements definition. In order to produce a full, complete work breakdown structure for our project, it's critical that you use a template. If you simply take a deliverable definition and try to sit down with a blank piece of paper and say, what do I need to do to produce a current situation document, you will come up with a number of items, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You will probably get 75 to 80% of all of the items required to produce a good current situation assessment. But you will miss some. You'll miss the 20%, simply because you can't think of everything at a time. That's where using a template becomes key. The template is not a single person trying to think of everything required at a single point in time. A template has been built over years of practical experience delivering current situation assessments. Your organization may have a wealth of templates that you can use. If your organization doesn't have any specific templates that you can use to create your work breakdown structure, find templates on the web. Find templates in organizational trade magazines. But go out and do a search and find good, practical, useful templates that allow you to build a good, solid, robust work breakdown structure. And actually a good source of templates is the source of all project management knowledge. What we're talking from is PMI. The PMI organization itself provides documentation on sample work breakdown structures across a wide range of industries and a wide range of applications that will allow you to ensure that the work breakdown structure that you're creating that's going to be deliverable based will provide a complete scope definition for each and every piece of work that's required to complete your project. With the work breakdown structure completed, you will present that to senior management, you will present that to your project sponsor, and you will say, based on this work breakdown structure, if I complete all of the work defined in this breakdown structure, will this A, satisfy the statement of requirements, the scope statement that has been produced, and more importantly, if this work is produced, is this your expectation of the work that I need to undertake as part of the project to achieve the business objectives for which this project was initiated? In other words, if my project successfully delivers the work defined in this work breakdown structure, will it address your business requirements? This concludes our first of 2 nuggets on project scope management. In this nugget focused on project scope definition, we talked about scope planning, identifying the level of detail required in the scope definition. Small, simple projects require a lighter level of scope planning and scope definition. Large, complex projects require a much more in-depth level of scope definition and scope planning. Once we understand the level of scope planning required, we go in and define what the project scope is. We define the boundary, we define what is in the scope of our project with sufficient detail that is clear, unambiguous, and we define what is not in the scope of our project. We define what we're not responsible for, and we define the interfaces between the boundary. What passes through our project boundary, what are the inputs and what are the outputs that our project must be capable of supporting, and then we produce the final deliverables that will be required to satisfy the scope definition, and finally we identify the work breakdown structure, the units of work that are required to allow us to satisfy the scope definition, to allow us to produce the specific deliverables that satisfy the scope requirements for the project, which in fact satisfy the business requirements for which the project was undertaken. In the next nugget, we will look at scope verification and scope control. This concludes our nugget on scope definition. I hope this video has been informative for you. and thank you very much for viewing.